The thermometer outside Henrik Larsson's cabin read -70 degrees Fahrenheit, but he stood in the doorway watching the other structures collapse one by one across the valley. His shelter, built from bent willow branches and ridiculed all summer as the stick house, remained standing while cabins made from thick squared logs folded under the weight of snow that had fallen without pause for 6 days. The settlers who had mocked his construction methods were either dead in the ruins of their homes or huddled in the town's stone church, the only other building still intact. What Henrik had built in 3 weeks with materials other men considered worthless would prove more valuable than all the engineering knowledge brought west by university-trained builders. Before we go further into Henrik's story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what the coldest temperature you've ever experienced was. And if survival stories like this fascinate you, hit that to subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode features an invention even more unbelievable than this one. Henrik Larsson arrived in New Uppsala, Dakota Territory, in June of 1882 with everything he owned packed into 2 canvas bags. He was 34 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had spent his first 3 years in America working railroad construction crews across Minnesota and the Dakota frontier. He had saved $217. It was enough to file a homestead claim and build shelter before winter, but not enough to do it the way other settlers expected. The settlement of New Uppsala sat in a valley surrounded by low hills covered in prairie grass and scattered groves of cottonwood and willow. 47 people lived there that summer, most of them Scandinavian immigrants like Henrik. They were building a community from nothing, and part of that process involved constructing proper cabins that would prove their commitment to civilized living. The standard approach was clear. Cut pine or cottonwood logs, square them if possible, notch the corners using dovetail or saddle joints, chink the gaps with mud and moss, build a plank door, install a stone or mud fireplace, and cover the roof with split shingles or sod. A good cabin took 6 to 8 weeks to build if you worked alone, less if you had help from neighbors. Henrik walked through the settlement observing the construction methods. He saw cabins going up, with walls 2 feet thick made from logs that required 2 men to lift. He saw elaborate corner joinery and careful chinking. He saw doors hung on iron hinges brought from Street Paul at considerable expense. The settlers were building homes that looked permanent and substantial. They were also spending money Henrik didn't have and using techniques that required tools he didn't own. On his 3rd day in New Uppsala, Henrik walked 2 miles downriver to a grove where willow trees grew thick along the water's edge. He spent that afternoon cutting young willow saplings, selecting ones that were straight and approximately 2 inches in diameter. He cut 40 of them, stripped the branches, and dragged them back to his homestead claim in bundles. His nearest neighbor, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Schmidt, watched this activity with obvious confusion. That evening, Wilhelm visited Henrik's camp and asked what he planned to do with willow branches. Henrik explained he was building a cabin. Wilhelm laughed, assuming it was a language barrier joke. When he realized Henrik was serious, his expression shifted from amusement to concern. He tried to explain that willow branches wouldn't work for cabin construction. They were too thin, too flexible, too weak. Henrik thanked him for the concern and continued working. Henrik began construction on the 1st day of August, 1882. He had spent July gathering materials that cost nothing but labor. Willow saplings, dried prairie grass bundled into tight sheaves, clay from the riverbank, moss from the shaded north sides of cottonwood trees, and stones for a fireplace base. Other settlers watched his preparations with a mixture of pity and amusement. They had seen desperate men before, but Henrik's approach seemed particularly misguided. The foundation he laid was simple but deliberate. He dug a circular trench 18 inches deep and 14 feet in diameter. Into this trench he set stones, creating a level base that would keep his structure off the ground and provide drainage. The circular shape was unusual. Every other cabin in New Uppsala was rectangular, following traditional building patterns brought from Europe. Henrik's circle prompted more questions he didn't bother answering. The framework went up over 4 days. Henrik had soaked his willow saplings in the river for a week, making them pliable. He set them vertically into the stone foundation, spacing them roughly 18 inches apart around the entire circumference. Each sapling was 12 feet long. Once all the vertical poles were positioned, Henrik began the process that would define his entire structure. He bent the tops of opposite poles toward each other, lashing them together with strips of rawhide he had made from a deer hide. The willow was flexible enough to bend without breaking, creating arches that met at the center point above what would become his cabin. The result looked like the skeleton of an overturned basket. Wilhelm Schmidt walked over to watch, accompanied by William Harrison, the settlement's carpenter. William was an educated man from Boston who had come west for his health. He had built proper houses back east and considered himself an authority on construction. He studied Henrik's bent willow framework for several minutes before speaking. He told Henrik that flexible poles would never support a roof, that the structure would collapse under the first heavy snow, that the circular design wasted interior space, and that a whole approach violated basic principles of architecture. Henrik listened politely. When William finished, Henrik asked him how an arch worked in a stone bridge. William explained that arches distributed weight outward and downward through compression. Henrik nodded and went back to work. Over the next 3 days, Henrik added horizontal willow rings at 1-foot intervals from bottom to top, creating a lattice pattern. Each horizontal piece was lashed to the vertical ribs with rawhide. The lashing wasn't random. Henrik used a specific pattern he had learned years earlier while working on a railroad crew that employed several Lakota men. One of them, a man named Catches the Wind, had explained how the teepee's structural strength came from the way poles were lashed together, creating a framework that could flex in high winds without collapsing. Henrik had remembered that conversation. The lattice complete, his cabin looked even more absurd than before. It resembled a giant birdcage or a skeletal dome. Children from the settlement came to stare at it. Adults made jokes within Henrik's hearing about the Norwegian madman building a stick house. Only one person showed genuine interest rather than mockery. Jonas Peterson was 68 years old, a fur trapper who had lived in the territory for 40 years. He had spent time with various tribes and recognized indigenous design principles in Henrik's work. He didn't say much, but he stopped by each afternoon to watch the progress with an expression that suggested he understood something the others didn't. Henrik began the insulation process in mid-August, working methodically through a system he had planned during his weeks of material gathering. The lattice framework was complete, creating a dome-shaped skeleton that measured 14 feet in diameter and 10 feet tall at its highest point. Now came the layers that would transform this skeletal structure into genuine shelter. The first layer was woven grass matting. Henrik had spent 2 weeks in July cutting prairie grass and braiding it into tight mats, each approximately 3 feet by 4 feet. He had 42 of these mats, and he attached them to the interior surface of the willow lattice, overlapping them like shingles. The grass was dry and dense, creating the first barrier against wind. This layer alone made the interior noticeably calmer when the wind blew. The weaving pattern trapped air, providing initial insulation. Other settlers who observed this phase remained skeptical. Grass would rot, they said. It would attract mice and insects. It would provide no real protection against winter cold. The second layer went on the exterior of the framework. Henrik mixed clay from the riverbank with water and moss, creating a thick paste. He packed this mixture into the diamond-shaped gaps in the willow lattice, working from bottom to top. Each section had to dry before he could move to the next area, so this phase took 12 days. The clay-moss mixture served multiple purposes. It sealed gaps against wind and rain, added structural rigidity to the flexible frame, and created a surface that would bond with the next layer. Henrik worked in the early morning and evening when the sun wouldn't dry the clay too quickly and cause cracking. The third layer was the most expensive element of his construction. Henrik had traded his rifle and $40 to a Lakota trading party for 6 buffalo hides. The hides were tanned but not decorated, intended for practical use rather than ceremonial purposes. He had kept these hides rolled and protected since purchasing them. Now he cut them into sections and soaked them in water until they became pliable. He stretched the wet hides over the clay layer, overlapping the edges and securing them to the willow frame with wooden pegs he had whittled during evening hours. As the hides dried, they shrank and tightened, creating a waterproof shell that conformed perfectly to the dome's curves. By early September, other settlers had finished their cabins. Wilhelm Schmidt's cabin was particularly impressive, built from squared cottonwood logs with proper corner notching and a shingled roof. It had cost him nearly $400 in materials and labor. William Harrison had supervised construction of 3 cabins in addition to his own, each following proper architectural principles. These structures looked permanent and substantial. They had rectangular rooms, glass windows brought from street pall, and doors that hung perfectly plumb. Henrik's cabin looked primitive by comparison. The buffalo hide exterior gave it a dark, organic appearance that seemed temporary. There were no windows, just a small smoke hole at the top and a low entrance covered by a hide flap. The entire structure had taken 3 weeks to build and cost Henrik $73 plus his rifle. Wilhelm Schmidt stood with William Harrison one evening looking at both cabins, his conventional log structure and Henrik's dome. Wilhelm shook his head slowly. He told William he gave Henrik's shelter until December at most. William agreed, noting that flexibility wasn't strength, and winter in Dakota Territory required genuine strength. November arrived with unusual cold. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit 2 weeks earlier than typical for the region. Snow fell on November 8th, a heavy wet snow that accumulated 8 inches overnight. The settlers of New Uppsala watched their thermometers nervously and burned through firewood faster than anticipated. Winter was announcing itself aggressively. Henrik's cabin performed better than he had expected. The small interior space, roughly 150 square feet, required minimal fire to maintain comfortable temperature. He had built a stone fireplace near the entrance, venting through a clay pipe that extended through the smoke hole at the dome's peak. The multiple layers of insulation trapped heat efficiently. He burned perhaps 1/3 the firewood his neighbors required for spaces twice as large. The buffalo hide exterior shed snow and rain without absorbing moisture. The willow framework flexed slightly when wind gusted, but never felt unstable. Other settlers were having mixed results. Most cabins stayed reasonably warm, though they consumed firewood at alarming rates. Several structures developed problems with chinking that cracked in the cold, creating gaps that let wind through. Wilhelm Schmidt spent 2 days re-chinking his entire cabin after the first snow revealed weaknesses. William Harrison's cabin performed well, but his fireplace smoked badly when wind came from certain directions. On November 23rd, a Lakota man named Standing Bear arrived in New Uppsala, leading 2 pack horses loaded with beaver pelts. He was perhaps 70 years old, known to the settlers as an honest trader who spoke adequate English. He set up a temporary trading post near the settlement's general store, exchanging pelts for coffee, sugar, tobacco, and steel needles. Henrik traded $2 silver for a large beaver pelt. While conducting this trade, Standing Bear studied Henrik's cabin with obvious interest. He walked around the structure slowly, examining the construction method. He asked Henrik, in a mixture of English and hand signs, who had taught him to build this way. Henrik explained that he had learned the framework technique from a Lakota railroad worker named Catches the Wind. Standing Bear nodded with recognition. He said the name, then told Henrik that Catches the Wind was his nephew, killed 2 years earlier in a horse accident. The old man stood quietly for a moment, then spoke carefully. He told Henrik that his cabin was built with wisdom. He said the winter coming would be unlike any winter the white settlers had seen in this territory. He pointed to signs Henrik hadn't noticed. The beavers were building dams twice their normal height. The bears had gone into hibernation 3 weeks early. The birds had migrated south in larger flocks than usual. The cottonwood trees had grown bark thicker than normal. Standing Bear said his people called such winters the Great White Death. He said it came perhaps once in a human lifetime. He said Henrik's cabin would survive, but the square houses with their heavy roofs would not. Most settlers who heard this warning dismissed it as superstition. William Harrison thanked Standing Bear politely, but explained that properly engineered structures were designed for extreme weather. The old man didn't argue. He finished his trading and left heading south. Henrik watched him go, then quietly began gathering additional firewood and stockpiling extra food supplies. January 15, 1883, began with unusual warmth. The temperature at dawn was 12 degrees Fahrenheit, almost comfortable compared to the previous week's cold. Henrik woke early and stepped outside to check his woodpile. The air felt heavy and still. No wind moved across the valley. The sky showed a peculiar yellow-gray color along the northern horizon that he had never seen before. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By noon, it was below zero. The wind arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, not gradually building but appearing suddenly like a wall of moving air. Within minutes, snow began falling so thick that Henrik couldn't see Wilhelm Schmidt's cabin 70 yards away. He brought extra firewood inside and secured his entrance flap, tying it shut from the interior. The wind increased throughout the afternoon. By evening, it was screaming across the valley with sustained speed that made the entire landscape disappear into white chaos. Henrik's cabin groaned and flexed. He could feel the willow framework bending, could hear the rawhide lashings creaking under stress. But nothing broke. The dome shape deflected the wind rather than catching it like a sail. Snow accumulated on the curved exterior and slid off in small avalanches rather than building up weight on any single point. The temperature continued dropping. By midnight on the first night, Henrik's thermometer read -28 degrees. He kept his fire burning steadily, feeding it split wood every 2 hours. The interior remained tolerable, perhaps 40 degrees, cold enough to see his breath, but warm enough to survive. Outside, the wind sounded like sustained thunder. Day 2 brought worse conditions. The temperature reached -40 degrees by afternoon. Snow continued falling without pause. The wind never diminished. Henrik could hear sounds from across the valley, muffled by the storm but recognizable. Cracking timber, something heavy collapsing, shouts that were torn away by wind before he could identify their source. He looked through a small observation port he had built into the hide, covering near his entrance. Visibility was perhaps 10 feet. Beyond that, everything was white. Motion. On the third day, the storm achieved truly catastrophic intensity. The temperature dropped to -55 degrees. Drifts outside Henrik's cabin reached heights that covered half his dome. The weight of accumulated snow pressed down on his structure. He felt the willow ribs bending inward, heard the framework protesting. For the first time since construction, he wondered if his design would fail. Then he heard it. A massive cracking sound from the direction of Wilhelm Schmidt's cabin, followed by a deep groaning noise and the crash of heavy timber falling. Henrik knew that sound, a roof collapsing under snow load. He pulled on his heaviest furs and opened his entrance flap enough to look out. The wind nearly tore the hide from his hands. Through the blowing snow, he caught a glimpse of Wilhelm's cabin. The entire roof had caved inward. The walls were still standing, but the structure was destroyed. Henrik secured his entrance and returned to his fire. He couldn't help Wilhelm in these conditions. Going outside would mean death. All he could do was keep his own fire burning and hope his neighbor had escaped before the collapse. The wind continued screaming. His cabin continued flexing. And the snow continued falling without end. Day 4 of the blizzard brought conditions that exceeded anything recorded in territorial history. The temperature at dawn was -63 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it had dropped further to -70. Henrik had never imagined such cold existed. His thermometer, mounted on a protected exterior wall where he could read it through his observation port, showed the mercury contracted to the bottom of its scale. The metal casing had frost crystals growing on its interior surface. The wind continued without diminishment. Snow had been falling for 96 consecutive hours. Drifts against the windward side of Henrik's cabin now reached heights that completely buried the lower third of his dome. The weight pressing down on his willow framework was enormous. He could see the ribs bending inward, flexing under load that would have snapped rigid logs. The entire structure groaned constantly, a sound like a ship in heavy seas. But the rawhide lashings held. The willow bent, but didn't break. Night fell early, the weak winter sun disappearing by 4 o'clock. Henrik sat by his fire, feeding it carefully measured pieces of wood. He had burned through half his supply. If the storm continued much longer, he would face a choice between freezing and going outside to retrieve more wood from his exterior pile, an action that might kill him. The interior temperature with the fire burning was perhaps 35 degrees. Without it, the cold would penetrate within hours. At 7 o'clock, he heard the sound that would haunt his memory for the rest of his life. A sharp crack like a rifle shot, followed immediately by a prolonged tearing noise and then a tremendous crash. The sounds came from the direction of William Harrison's cabin, perhaps 100 yards south. Henrik moved to his observation port. Visibility was nearly zero in the darkness and blowing snow, but he saw a dim glow that suddenly brightened. Fire. William's cabin had collapsed, and the fireplace or scattered embers had ignited the wreckage. Henrik pulled on every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped his face in wool, and forced open his entrance flap. The wind hit him like a physical blow. The cold burned his exposed skin instantly. He managed 3 steps from his cabin before realizing he couldn't see anything beyond arm's length. The fire from William's cabin was invisible in the storm. He had no way to reach it, no way to help. Going further would mean losing his way back to his own shelter. He retreated inside, his face already showing signs of frostbite from less than 1 minute of exposure. Through the rest of that night, Henrik heard other sounds, more cracking timber. Crashes that might have been walls collapsing or roofs caving in. Once, he thought he heard shouting, but the wind made it impossible to be certain. His own cabin continued its constant groaning. The willow ribs bent further inward under accumulated snow. He measured the deflection. The framework had compressed nearly 8 inches from its original shape, but it held. The dome flexed like a living thing, distributing the load, refusing to break. At midnight, the temperature outside reached -72 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow stopped falling on the morning of January 20th, 1883. Henrik woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural after 6 days of constant wind. He lay still for a moment, listening, wondering if he was imagining it. Then he realized the groaning of his cabin's framework had ceased. The pressure had stabilized. He moved to his observation port and looked out at a landscape transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow covered everything in drifts that reached heights of 12 to 15 feet in places. The contours of the valley had been erased, replaced by smooth white waves frozen in place. The sky was pale blue and cloudless. The sun reflected off the snow with painful brightness. The temperature had risen to -40 degrees, almost warm compared to the previous days. Henrik forced open his entrance, which required significant effort as snow had packed against the hide flap. He stepped outside wearing snowshoes he had made months earlier. Without them, he would have sunk to his chest. The cold burned his lungs with each breath. He stood looking across the valley at what remained of New Uppsala. 13 of the 17 cabins were completely destroyed. He could see collapsed roofs, walls that had buckled and fallen, structures reduced to jumbled piles of logs and debris partially buried in snow. Wilhelm Schmidt's cabin was a total loss. William Harrison's cabin had burned to its stone foundation. The Schmidt family's cabin showed one wall still standing, the others collapsed inward. The Johansson cabin was simply gone, flattened completely. 4 structures had survived. The stone church at the center of the settlement still stood, its thick walls and slate roof having withstood the weight. Henrik's dome was intact. The Olsen cabin, built partially into a hillside for protection, had lost its roof, but walls remained, and the Peterson cabin, belonging to old Jonas, showed damage but was still standing. Henrik began walking toward the nearest collapsed structure, the cabin that had belonged to a family named Anderson. He found Thomas Anderson frozen 30 feet from his destroyed home. The man had been trying to reach the church when the cold killed him. His wife and 2 children were inside the ruined cabin, also dead, crushed when the roof collapsed. Over the next 2 hours, Henrik found 3 more bodies. Wilhelm Schmidt had died trying to dig his family out after his roof failed. He was frozen solid, still holding the shovel. Henrik couldn't determine if Wilhelm's wife and children had survived. The cabin wreckage was too extensive to search without tools and help. Smoke rose from the church. Henrik made his way there, a journey of 300 yards that took 20 minutes in the deep snow. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and found 23 people inside, crowded around 2 fires built on the stone floor. They were survivors from various families, shocked and traumatized. Several showed signs of frostbite. All were exhausted and hungry. When Henrik entered, every face turned toward him. William Harrison was there, having escaped his cabin before it burned. He stared at Henrik for a long moment, then looked away without speaking. The survivors in the church had burned through most of the wooden pews to stay warm. They had perhaps 2 days of fuel remaining. Food supplies were scattered across various destroyed homes, most of it inaccessible under collapsed structures and deep snow. The temperature outside remained brutally cold. Everyone understood their situation was desperate. William Harrison approached Henrik on the second day after the storm. His face showed frostbite damage on both cheeks and his nose. His hands were wrapped in cloth bandages. He had lost everything when his cabin burned, escaping with only the clothes he wore. He stood in front of Henrik for several seconds before speaking. Then he asked the question everyone in the church wanted answered. How had Henrik's cabin survived when structures built with proper engineering had failed? Henrik explained, without pride or satisfaction. He described how rigid structures resisted force until they broke, while flexible structures absorbed and distributed force. He explained how the dome shape shed snow rather than collecting it. He described how the willow ribs bent under load but didn't snap because the wood remained alive and flexible. He talked about the importance of multiple, thin layers for insulation rather than single thick barriers. He explained how the small interior space required less fuel to heat and provided fewer opportunities for structural failure. William listened carefully, asking technical questions. Others gathered around to hear the explanation. When Henrik finished, William asked if the same principles could be used to build emergency shelters for those whose homes were destroyed. Henrik said yes, but the survivors would need to work together and work quickly. Another storm could arrive at any time. Over the next 3 days, Henrik taught 15 men and women how to construct emergency survival shelters using his method. They couldn't replicate his cabin exactly. They lacked buffalo hides and had limited time. But they could build simplified versions using available materials. Teams went out in shifts, working in the extreme cold for short periods before returning to the church to warm up. They identified 3 willow groves within reasonable distance and began cutting saplings. They gathered dried grass from areas where wind had blown snow clear. They stripped bark from cottonwood trees to use as additional covering. They mixed clay with snow and water, creating a slurry that would freeze solid once applied. The work was brutal in -30-degree temperatures, but desperation drove them forward. By January 28th, they had completed 3 communal shelters, each larger than Henrik's original cabin, designed to house 6 to 8 people. The structures were crude compared to Henrik's carefully built dome, but they followed the same principles. Flexible willow frameworks, multiple layers of insulation, dome shapes that shed snow, and small interior spaces that could be heated efficiently. On January 29th, another storm arrived, not as severe as the first blizzard, but still dangerous, with temperatures dropping to -45 degrees and heavy snowfall. The new shelters held. The willow frameworks flexed and groaned but didn't collapse. The survivors huddled inside around small fires, stayed warm enough to survive. The remaining damaged conventional cabins, weakened by the first storm, finished collapsing under the new snow load. When this second storm cleared on February 2nd, New Uppsala had lost 17 of its original structures, but had gained 3 new ones that worked better than what they replaced. Spring arrived late in 1883. Snow remained on the ground until mid-April. When it finally melted, the full extent of the damage across Dakota Territory became clear. The blizzard had killed over 200 people in scattered settlements and isolated homesteads. Entire families had frozen to death. Livestock losses were catastrophic. Communities that had existed were simply gone, abandoned by survivors who moved south or back east. New Uppsala had lost 24 of its original 47 residents. Some died in collapsed cabins, others froze, attempting to reach safety. 3 families had survived the storm but left the territory as soon as travel became possible, unwilling to face another winter in a place that had proven so deadly. The settlement that remained was smaller, traumatized, but determined to rebuild properly. The survivors constructed new homes using variations of Henrik's design. Not everyone built domes. Some created hybrid structures that combined conventional log walls with flexible roof frameworks that could shed snow. Others built smaller, better insulated cabins with reinforced roofs designed to flex rather than resist. The principle remained consistent. Flexibility under extreme load was more valuable than rigid strength. Word of what happened in New Uppsala spread through the territory during spring and summer. Other settlements had experienced similar catastrophes during the blizzard. The story of the Norwegian immigrant whose ridiculed cabin had survived when engineered structures failed became widely discussed. In June, 2 newspaper reporters from Street Paul traveled to New Uppsala to document what they called the miracle cabin. They interviewed Henrik, examined his structure, and took measurements and photographs. The articles appeared in newspapers across Minnesota and Dakota Territory. One headline read, "Savage Wisdom Saves Civilized Settlers." Another called Henrik's Cabin, the structure that defeated winter's fury. The stories attracted attention from unexpected sources. A professor of engineering from the University of Minnesota traveled to New Uppsala in July to study Henrik's construction method. He spent 3 days measuring, sketching, and asking technical questions. He later published a paper titled "Flexible Architecture for Extreme Climates" that described the structural principles in academic terms. Henrik found the attention uncomfortable. He gave interviews because people asked, but he refused multiple offers to pay him for teaching his techniques. A lumber company from Minneapolis wanted to hire him as a consultant for developing new construction methods. A railroad company offered him work designing structures for high-altitude stations where snow load was extreme. Henrik declined everything. He explained that he had learned the framework technique from a Lakota man named Catches the Wind. He said the insulation principles came from watching how indigenous peoples built winter lodges. He said he had simply combined existing knowledge in a way that made sense for his situation. By autumn of 1883, 7 settlements across Dakota and Montana territories had built structures using modifications of what was now being called the Larson method or flex frame construction. Henrik helped several communities with initial construction, traveling to teach the basics, then returning to New Uppsala. He never accepted payment. When people asked why he shared his knowledge freely, he told them about his partner, John Hoffman, who had died years earlier. He said good ideas should spread because keeping them secret helped no one. Henrik Larsson lived in his willow frame cabin until 1897, when he finally built a larger conventional home after marrying a widow named Ingrid Johansson. He was 49 years old at his wedding, she was 42. They had no children together, but Ingrid's 2 daughters from her first marriage became his family. He left his original dome standing, using it for storage and as a workshop. Visitors to New Uppsala often asked to see the famous structure, and Henrik showed it to them without ceremony or self-importance. The technique he had pioneered spread across the northern frontier territories through organic adoption rather than formal promotion. By 1900, historians estimate that at least 50 settlements between Montana and Minnesota had built structures using flexible framework principles. The specific implementations varied based on available materials and local needs. Some were pure dome designs like Henrik's original. Others were hybrid structures combining conventional walls with flexible roofs. A few were elongated barrel shapes that housed multiple families. Indigenous peoples who saw these structures recognized their own ancestral knowledge reflected in white construction for the first time. Several Lakota elders visited New Uppsala in the late 1880s, specifically to see how their traditional building wisdom had been adapted. They approved of Henrik's work because he openly credited Catches the Wind and acknowledged that he had learned from indigenous teachers. This honest attribution was rare among white settlers, most of whom preferred to claim original innovation rather than admit learning from those they considered primitive. The winter of 1906 brought another severe blizzard to Dakota Territory, though not as catastrophic as the 1883 storm. Several conventional cabins collapsed. Every structure built, using flexible framework principles, survived without significant damage. The practical validation continued accumulating over decades. Insurance companies eventually began offering lower rates for homes built with flex frame designs in extreme weather regions. Railroad companies adopted the principles for mountain stations and remote outposts. Henrik died on March 7, 1910, at age 62 from pneumonia. He was buried in the New Uppsala Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley where his cabin still stood. His gravestone was simple. It listed his name, birth year, death year, and the phrase, "He built with wisdom." The funeral was attended by over 100 people, many of whom had traveled significant distances. Several indigenous elders came to pay respects to a white man who had learned from their people and gave proper credit. His original cabin remained standing until 1938, when it was carefully disassembled and donated to the Minnesota Historical Society. It was reconstructed as an exhibit in Street Paul, where it remained on display until 1973. Thousands of people saw it over those decades, many unaware that the principles it demonstrated were still being used in modern survival, shelter design, and emergency housing. The story of Henrik Larsson teaches that innovation often means recognizing wisdom that already exists in unexpected places. The settlers who mocked his stick house valued appearance over function, tradition over adaptation. Henrik valued survival over pride. When nature tested human assumptions with -70-degree cold and 6 days of relentless snow, the flexible structure, built with borrowed wisdom, outlasted everything constructed with conventional certainty. Sometimes the wisest engineering begins with humility.